You might have done a great analysis and you would have come to a conclusion. But many good analysts are always skeptical about their own analysis. They would want to ensure that many of their own personal bias doesn't affect their analysis. And therefore, once you've performed an analysis, you may still want to ask various questions as to what if I was wrong. In an earlier video, we saw about how to perform sensitivity analysis in MS Excel using the data table feature. In this video, we're going to talk about how to perform a scenario analysis. Firstly, let's understand the difference between a sensitivity analysis and a scenario analysis. In a sensitivity analysis, our objective is to figure out how sensitive is our end outcome to a small change in a particular variable. A scenario analysis is also a tool through which we assess what could happen to our outcome if certain aspects of our analysis change. But the idea of a scenario analysis, especially in the context of equity research and valuation, is to understand what if our thesis goes wrong. As an analyst, you would have analyzed an industry, a company, the economy. You would have your own thesis to arrive at your growth forecast and profit forecast. Now, at times, we may have questions as to what if this thesis goes wrong. In fact, a standard aspect of any research report is the risk to thesis. Now, scenario analysis helps us to answer that particular question. I'm going to explain that to you with the example of this Colgate-Palmolive India model. This model is stored in a Google Drive and I've shared a link to that below in this. So let us quickly understand how this model works so that you have some context to what we're going to do now. So in this model, we've analyzed the past growth rate and we have certain growth rates here that we assume for future. And looking at the past track record on cost and other things, we also have our cost data here. In our income statement, we forecast sales using these growth rates and the cost using our cost to sales ratios. Through this, we arrive at our EBIT, and using the EBIT and the NOPAT, we have arrived at the free cash flow, and through that we've got our DCF valuation and we've got our fair value per share. Now, of course, this exercise was done from a training perspective, but let us just for a moment pretend that we have analyzed the business thoroughly and we have certain thesis behind why we have come up with this particular values for these assumptions. So let us say my base case or my base thesis in the assumption is that Colgate may continue to grow slower over the next couple of years owing to competition coming from new players such as Patanjali or Sri Sri and other homegrown brands. But somewhere around 2021, we believe that these competitions may not last long and Colgate's growth rate may start improving. That is why we expect the growth rate to remain muted in the first couple of years and to start improving later on. Now, this is our thesis, and based on these theses, we have come up with these numbers. But a risk to thesis could be, what if the competition actually intensifies and Colgate loses market share and as a result, their sales drops further? Maybe this could also result in a price war and their expense ratios could therefore increase. Under these circumstances, what could happen? So I would like to understand that. And of course, I may also have a view somewhere I may believe that maybe this competition may fizzle out faster and therefore Colgate's growth rate could rise much more faster and much more earlier. So under these circumstances, we want to look at what could happen to our model. So one way to do that in Excel is through a scenario manager tool. So before we use scenario manager tool, firstly we have to visualize the scenarios we are talking about, and then we're going to identify or which are the variables that could increase or change when these different scenarios takes place. So perhaps based on the scenarios we are talking about, maybe there are just a bunch of cells we are thinking that could change. Maybe my sales growth could differ. And let us for now just from a training perspective assume cost of materials to sales ratio could change. These are the 10 cells we are talking about that could undergo a change. When you're actually performing a scenario analysis, you may even think of many more cells. But for now, I'm confining myself to these 10 variables. 5 variables for sales growth and 5 variables for cost of materials. Now, in order to perform our scenario analysis, there are 2 ways. One is to use the scenario manager and another one is to use the index function. I'm going to take you through both the options here. So first, let's look at the scenario manager tool. So in this, what we're going to do is we go to data, what if analysis, and click on scenario manager. Now right now, we see a message saying that there are no scenarios defined. Choose to add scenarios. Let me click on add so that I could add a scenario. And it's asking me for a scenario name, and let me give it a name. For now, let me call it as base case. And now we have to mention which are the cells that will change under different scenarios. So it's not just M16. The cells that are going to change are M16 to Q16, comma, M18 to Q18. These are the 10 values that could undergo a change. So we're going to select that and click OK. Now if you look at it, the scenario manager tool has already picked up the data from our spreadsheet and has populated the values here in this dialog box for different cells. Now, one of the things that we can do is change the values here, but I would recommend not to do that. Take the values, click OK. If you want to add more scenarios, you can click add and add a scenario. But I would recommend click OK and exit. Rather than adding scenario here and changing value, what I would recommend is close it and let's look at another scenario. And let's look at what would happen if that particular scenario turns out. Let's say if these newcomers intensify the competition and that ends up the company losing out sales in future, and let's say we think that could result in the sales falling to the tune of 3% or 5% over a period of time. So let me type in those values here. And maybe this could also gradually result in margin contraction and my expense ratios could increase. Let's say that could go from 36 to 37. 38 and maybe 39 and 39. I think this could also happen. Once we have saved it, I'm going to repeat the scenario manager process. Go to data, what if analysis, scenario manager. Here we see the scenario we had saved earlier appearing here. So what we're going to do is add one more scenario. I'm going to add a scenario. Let me call this as increased competition or intense competition. Now once I've given this name, you notice that the changing cells are already populated based on what we selected in the first scenario. And let me click OK. And again, we see all the values populated. We can change it, but I would again recommend not to do that. Click OK. We've created both the scenarios. What does this tool do to us? How do we make use of this tool? For now, I'm going to limit myself to 2 scenarios, but you can add as many scenarios as you want. So what I can do is, I can easily switch between scenarios and see the outcome. So I open the scenario manager tool, and here if we look at it, if I want to know what could happen if base case scenario happens, so I'll select base case and click on show. You notice that we see a different fair value and our assumptions would have also undergone change. And I can easily click on intense competition, click on show, and this is going to give me what is going to happen if intense competition happens. So it is this way very easy for me to switch between various assumptions and see what happens to the end outcome. I can select base case show. You notice my assumptions are changing. I select intense and click show. You see the numbers changing. Not just that, you can also create a summary report here. So I'll click on summary. So it is asking what sort of report I want. I want a scenario summary. And it's asking in the summary, do I need an output? And if I need an output, which cell contains the output? Perhaps in these kind of cases, the output I would want is the fair value of share. Now I'm going to select this. Now, one more thing you have to understand is when you use the scenario summary tool, the output necessarily has to be in the same sheet in which the scenario manager is created. The scenario manager is sheet specific. So if the output is in some other cell, it's not going to work. Of course, if your output is in another sheet, all you have to do is create a link to that sheet in our assumption sheet or in the sheet in which you have scenario manager. And let me click OK. Now that I have done that, you notice that I get a summary report here where it says if it's base case, what are the various assumptions? In the intense competition case, what are the various assumptions? And what are my output? What do we make use of this? I mean, how do we make use of this? As an analyst or as a decision maker, this gives us an extra perspective. So yes, we expect the base case to happen and therefore we think the fair value is 240 or roundabout. But in case competition intensifies, the valuation could go to 170. Question is, therefore, what should I do? That depends on, are you willing to take the risk? Or what is your assessment of the chances that the competition could intensify? And what is your risk appetite? Are you willing to lose so much in case if the competition intensifies? Based on that, you can take a decision. The final element is, of course, a matter of human judgment. There's one more way to do scenario analysis. In terms of theory, the theory remains same, just the technique in Excel changes. But why do I need another method? Quite a few reasons. One is the scenario manager tool is not very intuitive for an end user. So let's say I've built this tool and later on somebody wants to look at what happens if scenario 1 or base scenario happens, what happens if intense competition happens. They need to know that scenario manager has been created, and then they also need to know that they have to go to the data, what if analysis, and click on scenario manager to access it. People who are not comfortable with Excel may not know how to do this, how to go navigate to this particular part. That's not very intuitive either. Of course, using VBA, you can make the user interface better, but then you need to know how to write a VBA, and then you will have to save your file as a macro enabled file. And one more thing is, scenario manager tool can at the most have 30 cells, does not allow more than 30 cells. So if I'm just going to try a dummy scenario just to illustrate, and I'm going to select more than 30 cells here. Right, let me add a few more. So that's 20, 25, 30, and let me add some more cells. So I've got 35 cells in place, and I'm going to click OK. Notice it says it cannot allow more than 32, actually, not 30. It cannot allow more than 32 cells. Right? That's another limitation of using the scenario manager. Third, as I said, scenario manager is sheet specific. While we have created the scenario and we can access it from the ANA sheet in which we created, if I were to move to a different sheet and look for it, you will notice that I wouldn't see any scenario. So you cannot use the scenario manager to change assumptions that are several sheets away. This also necessitates that all the assumptions are in one place. Sometimes when you're building model, these are not limitations that you want to live with. You want more flexibility. That is where we're going to see the other option to create this, and this time we're going to create it using the index function in MS Excel. So what I'm going to do now is, for the sales growth and cost of materials, the various assumptions that I'm looking at, I'm going to enter it right in this sheet itself. I'm going to say base case and intense competition. These are the two scenarios I'm dealing with, and if the intense competition scenario happens, then the values are going to be 1, -3, -5, and so on. Otherwise, it's going to be 1%, 1%, and then 3, 3, and 3. That's what we originally had. So my sales growth now, there are two possible options, and the sales growth is going to be derived based on these two. The same holds true for cost of materials as well. So what we did earlier is that we are going with this base case and intense competition. So what we want Excel to do is, based on the scenario that the end user chooses, I want the sales growth to be populated accordingly. So in my non-time series data, I'm going to choose a scenario. I want end user to choose 1 or 2. So if they choose 1, I want to pick up the base case. 2 is going to be the intense case. For ease of use, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to name this cell. I'm going to name this cell by selecting this box. To the left of my formula box, I can see a name. I just give a name scenario. Right, so this cell is now named scenario. And what I'm going to do is, I want Excel, if it's 1, I want it to choose base case, and if it's 2, I want it to choose intense competition. So I'm going to use an index function. I'm going to say index. This is the range. I want Excel to pick up data from this range. But which data to pick up? I want this to pick up data that's based on the scenario that's chosen. So if this is 1, pick up the first data. If this is 2, pick up the second data. So same thing I can also do with my cost of materials to sales. I'm going to use index. We want to pick up data from these two cells, and if it is 1, then I want the first data. If it is 2, I want the second. Now what you notice is, it's very easy for the end user to change, because right in the screen they can type 2 and then they can see what happens to the valuation. Or if they want to go back, they can type 1 and see what happens. They really don't have to go navigate all the way to a data what if analysis and scenario manager. And because we are using index function and we are linking cell, we don't have the 32 cell constraint. We can have as many cells as we want. And we can also have the assumptions in various sheets. And all we have to do is use the index function and link it to this one. In this, I'm also going to give you a quick tip in terms of few ways in which we can improve the user experience. Because one is base case, two is intense competition. That is something you and I know because we discussed that. But later on, a user may not understand that. They may try and typing 4, right, which takes everything for a toss. So firstly, how do I control the input? And secondly, how do I tell the user what does each one mean? For this, at the time of designing, I would use data validation tool. So I'll go to data and I'm going to go to the data validation tool. Here I'm going to specify that do not allow any value. You have to allow a list. And this list should be between 1 and 2. Only these two values should be allowed. So what happens here, there's a drop down created and the user can choose only between 1 and 2. If they try typing anything else, MS Excel would not accept that. And to make it more intuitive, what you can also do is in the same validation tool, you could add an input message. I might type, because right now, earlier when we saw, it was still not clear as to what 1 and 2 meant. So I'm going to type here 1 for base case, 2 for intense competition. I've typed this message and maybe I'll also put an error alert where I'm going to tell users that please choose a scenario value from the drop down. So as you can see here, now that I've put the input message, the moment users select this cell, they're going to see this message. So they know what 1 means and what 2 means. They can accordingly choose. And despite that, if you make a mistake, they ended up typing 3. It tells them what the issue is. It's going to tell them, please choose a scenario value from drop down. So this is the other way in which you can create or work with scenario analysis in MS Excel.